For the ancient world, the watershed was the Trojan War. It was the defining event. For the Romans, though, it was an essentially Greek event, and it became part of Roman supersessionism that some new event should define the new dispensation among gods and men. This was the project of Virgil, which he renounced on his deathbed. But later, with the fall of the Julio-Claudians and the rise of the Flavian dynasty, the Jewish War was adopted as the epoch-defining event, the intrusion of the divine will into history. Memorializing and mythologizing this event was the project of Josephus. It subsequently became grafted to the Christian narrative and the Jewish one, but reshaped by the motifs of the new Troy. It continued in this form throughout the Middle Ages, and conspicuously in the Grail legends, the deep impact of Roman supersessionism of the new Troy and its mythology, adopting the Jewish War as the event that reveals the will of the gods, and so is the great wellspring of cultural resources and heroic values, is something we still live with but hardly understand. The structures set in place by the Flavians are still with us. Among the systems of cyclic decline found in, or to be inferred from ancient sources, is this. A full cycle consists of 360 generations of men, each generation being 70 years. This yields a great year of 25,200 years, a very near approximation of the precession of the equinoxes, 25,772 years. In this scheme, the quality of souls gradually declines until only the hollow men prevail. There are 360 types, and in any generation all of them are present but in different numbers. In the late cycle, amidst the swarm of hollow men, from time to time there is what seemed to be an intrusion from an earlier phase, the eruption of a volcanic genius like Nietzsche, or a pure pneumatic like Guénon. But it is noteworthy that in both those cases they were sickly specimens, as if their incarnate body could not bear the soul that inhabited it. The great souls of the late cycle are, more likely than not, cripples. The decline is not just spiritual, it extends all the way to physical metal. I didn't know who the Dalai Lama was. In all honesty, I was a young fellow and I was there because of a girl and her latest infatuation with some Eastern guru. But we had seats at the front and arrived early, and I had a direct view of the monks lighting the incense before the show. It was fascinating. I watched them close up. It was somewhat elaborate, but they were masterful and practiced. Then suddenly, the entire auditorium was filled with the scent. It was instantly omnipresent. And the thing was, there was no smoke. I took this as the gold standard of incense burning. I saw it again in Japan. The art is to create an invisible presence. The scent isn't stronger in one part of the space than another, omnipresent and uniform, and smokeless, with no apparent source. A mystery. That was the ambience the incense monks created very carefully for the Dalai Lama to walk out into. There is always a cosmos within walking distance, by nature and necessarily so. A cosmos being an adequate order of symbols, or in other words, an icon in the fullest sense. Symbols being things that provoke Platonic recollection, and human proportions and axial verticality being as they are. You can always find an entire an adequate for purpose collection of perspicuous symbols within walking distance, wheresoever you might be. It is a matter of attention at the proper scale. In most cases, there is, for a start, the sky above and all that it reveals as a symbol, and the horizon. But even in the most depleted urban settings, there are, for a start, thresholds and windows and everything they imply. There is no locale within a human distance that cannot be re-enchanted, made, or rather found to be, translucent and numinous in this way. Since I first read it decades ago, I have always felt that Edward Said's account of Orientalism is fundamentally, even viciously mistaken. Assuredly, the Orientalists were servants of their time, but they were the first scholars and artists in the entire history of the West to attempt a sympathetic understanding of the Oriental other. Against the long history of outright demonisation, the Orientalists, for the first time, portrayed the Oriental other as noble, dignified, spiritual, brave, and yes, alluring. How are the works of the Orientalists not a huge improvement on everything that came before them? This is aside from the grievous sins of omission in Said's study. He doesn't mention the German Orientalist because Germany didn't have an empire for them to be quislings of, and so don't fit his thesis. On the whole, I think the book has been pernicious in that it politicised a body of cultural exchange that was largely conducted in goodwill by open minds and has undermined opportunities for West-East understandings. What became of the cup, the chalice, of the Jewish temple when it was sacked by Titus and Vespasian? The menorah was paraded in triumph through the streets of Rome. The temple stores of gold were never found. Josephus, the turncoat, boasts that the chalice was given to him, spoils. But this question, what happened to the altar cup, I posit, is the raw material for what became the Grail legends of Christendom. Again, there is the conflation of the crucifixion with the fall of the temple, the cup used to collect the blood of Christ, and the sacred cup in the holy sanctuary. Flavian shadows and motifs are found throughout Grail literature, and the literature and legends surrounding it. Vespasian appears as a Christian hero in many adjacent medieval texts. The idea here, though, is that when the temple falls, the Shekinah becomes both occluded and fugitive. The quest for the lost Grail is the quest for a sanctity that was once indwelling. It can be illuminating, rather than corrosive and subversive, to admit such conflations in our sources, and to acknowledge the foundations of much Christian mythology in the ugly history of ancient wars. The legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus, I maintain, is one of the guises of Plato, the cosmological Plato, the Egyptian Plato of the Timaeus Critias. He is thrice great because of his knowledge of the three realms. We recognise him as Plato in Christian writers who refer to this Hermes as a great pagan sage who foreshadowed Christianity. That's Plato. Hermes Trismegistus is a Roman-era concoction, a synthetic Greco-Egyptian luminary, master of the cosmological sciences. But the figure in the background is Plato. The legend took shape, I contend, as part of the same process by which the Egyptian priests who taught Solon in the Timaeus were named and identified and developed as the backstory to Plato's dialogue. What is most valuable in Steiner, and so in Goethe, is an esotericism grounded in biology. This is in contrast to developments from Jung and Corbin too, where the interface is psychology, or others where it is physics. Steiner, the Goetheans, draw on the biological sciences, the life sciences, as the arena of mystery. This is more fully Platonic because it restores an organic vision of the cosmos upon the correct diagnosis that this is what is lacking in modernity on every level, Platonic organicism. Where others try to match Plato's Timaeus in quantum physics or psychologize its mythic dimensions, Steiner starts with the declaration that the cosmos is a wholly living creature. He doesn't acknowledge Plato as such. It is coming from Goethe and from Paracelsus, but Plato's Timaeus is the mother text for the whole of German vitalism. In a cafe on Hibiscus Road one morning, I met a young man from New Zealand and we had breakfast. He had just crossed the border from Thailand. He was a spiritual seeker, but he was in a bad way. What had gone so wrong? He had studied Buddhism for years, he explained. He had looked at all the religions and Buddhism ticked all the boxes. He had travelled to Thailand with a vague plan to perhaps become a monk. But nothing was as he expected. People were worshipping gods and doing all sorts of un-Buddhist things. The monks were corrupt. They took bribes, smoked cigarettes, and some of them had girlfriends, he explained. And everyone fussed over protocol and stupid rules. Moreover, most Buddhists he met didn't even meditate. He was shocked and deeply disillusioned. As bad as the Catholics, he said. He was going back to New Zealand, back to the drawing board, back home to reconsider his options. It is surely no coincidence that the two great avatars of the Occidental tradition, Jesus of Nazareth and Socrates of Athens, died not so much by state oppression, but by the state under pressure from the demos. The jury of Athens voted for the execution of Socrates, and it was the mob in Jerusalem that called for the execution of Christ. Both men died by judicial process in the custody of the authorities. That motif is at the very heart of Western civilization. But in both cases, the judicial process is only the villain because it is corrupted by a reference to the opinions of the crowd, mere opinion rules, rather than a higher justice and truth. Democracy, as a former Prime Minister of Australia once said, is war without blood. A democracy, by definition, is a cold civil war. The contending parties have agreed to settle their differences without violence, for now. But it only ever takes a contested election or other fraying for the civil war to warm up again. That is the fate of all failed democracies. In some Western democracies today, most notably the United Kingdom, there is already what can only be described as low-level civil war. No-go zones and negotiated policing are typical of urban insurgencies, what Chairman Mao called the stalemate stage. It is hard for a democracy to recover from there. Too many people have abandoned the truce and have already decided that their grievances and their dreams can no longer be addressed by the ballot. First graffiti, then vandalism, then arson, then bashings, then killings, then revenge. The symbolism attributed to the trans-Saturnian or the modern planets in astrology is incoherent and, well, modern. Neptune is so-called purely because it's blue-green in a telescope. Uranus rules telecommunications because its sigil, an anagram of her shell, looks a bit like a television aerial. And Pluto is a long way away and so must be infernal. Most of this was put together by astrologers like Alan Leo and the Theosophist. There is no need for these farragos. Traditional astrology has the means to track long cycles of time without these intruders. The Chinese, for example, know a thing or two about long cycles. They don't need the modern planets. Look what they do with the cycles of Jupiter. The first step in restoring some semblance of an intelligent astrological cosmology is to remove these trans-Saturnian bodies, invisible to the naked eye, only accessible with technological aids beyond the natural human frame, from meaningful consideration. We are told St. Patrick was involved in a 40-day fast on top of a hill. He was assailed by snakes, which he drove into the sea on March 17. This myth is astrological and calendrical. The top of the hill is the equinox, and the snakes are the eclipses that occur around the equinox. The 40 days tells us that this is about Lent and Easter. The miracle of St. Patrick was the solilunar calculation that ensured Easter Sunday never falls on an eclipse. Christ conquered the darkness. There is a story that appears in numerous traditions but has its roots in the mythology of Athena and Hephaestus. The story concerns a weaver and a blacksmith. The blacksmith is falsely imprisoned. His wife, a weaver, learns the pattern to the lock on the prison doors. She weaves the pattern into a prayer rug, which the jailer permits her to give to her husband. The blacksmith then prays, gazing at the prayer rug for months, some say years, some say his whole life, until one day he sees it, the pattern. Skilled with metals, he improvises a key, opens the doors, and is freed. There are other similar stories about the blacksmith and the weaver. This is the most revealing of them, and is itself tightly crafted. Together, I suspect these weaver and blacksmith stories constitute a body of tradition that moves across centuries from very ancient oral sources, and it has a direct connection with the cultus of these deities on the Acropolis, and the extrapolation of the cultus that forms the background to the philosophy of Plato. The greatest failing of the Western occult tradition is that it lacks a lingua potentia, an adequate magical language. Latin is merely liturgical. Hebrew and Arabic and Greek have potency, but are oriental. In practice, Hebrew is adopted for this purpose, but this entails the wholesale Kabbalizing of the Western tradition, to the point that Western occultism is just Jewish occultism for Gentiles. Hildegard of Bingen snatched some vocabulary from angels, and Dean Kelly found some barbarous Latin in a crystal ball. But Western occultism is not properly grounded in a bed of language.